This training covers Safe Place policies and procedures and is presented by Katie McCullough, Shelter Manager, and Stacy Conkle, Deputy Director. Safe Place is committed to providing safety to, empowering, and advocating for survivors of domestic violence and sex trafficking and their children. We strive to provide safety, support, and services from a survivor-centered, trauma-informed, empowerment-based approach. We believe the survivor knows best for their situation, and staff are trained to work from a place of empathy and cultural sensitivity. The policy manual is designed to provide staff and volunteers with a guide for how to respond in a uniform, fair manner to client needs and situations. While some policies and procedures may result in extreme measures to maintain a safe and secure environment, such as calling law enforcement, Children's Protective Services, and/or exiting a client from shelter services, those responses are always a last resort, and staff will make every effort to work collaboratively with clients to avoid those measures. Leadership staff are open to feedback from clients, staff, and volunteers to continue shaping our policies and procedures in a way that is survivor-centered, trauma-informed, and empowerment-based. The following training will review some policies from the policy manual that staff and volunteers frequently encounter when working with clients. It is expected that staff and volunteers review the policy manual in its entirety each year as it's reviewed and updated, and ensure that you have a good understanding of those policies and procedures and know how to access it in situations where you might need that assistance. The acceptance of legal documents policy isn't in place to ensure that legal requests such as warrants and subpoenas are handled appropriately without violation of client confidentiality. There are many laws that protect the work we do and the clients we work with, and it is our duty to protect the confidentiality of survivors unless the survivor provides a valid time-limited signed release. We will seek legal counsel for representation in cases when client records or advocates are subpoenaed for information pertaining to our clients. Often we will reach out to the Michigan Coalition to End Domestic and Sexual Violence for that support to either help us themselves or link us with an attorney who can work with us to help file a motion to quash so that our staff either don't have to testify or we don't have to release the records in order to protect that client. Because again, there are many laws in place that do protect that information. When client records are subpoenaed, the subpoena must name the proper custodian of records, who is our CEO, Ellen. In any case, whether the subpoena is served properly or not, you do still have to notify the CEO. We don't ignore it. We do follow up with it. For subpoenas, if the subpoena is not properly served and doesn't name the proper custodian of records, you should not accept the subpoena and say that you are not authorized to accept it, and immediately contact the CEO. If the subpoena does name the proper custodian or CEO, then you go ahead and contact her immediately for that to be properly served on her as the custodian of records. For arrest warrants, we will get police come to the door with arrest warrants, and that can be a little intimidating, and that's often something that staff or volunteers will reach out to on-call or to supervisors for guidance, which is totally fine and something that we encourage you to do. But just because there's a police officer at the door saying they have an arrest warrant for someone does not mean that they are allowed in our building or that they're allowed to know whether or not that person is here. So an arrest warrant the warrant allows officers to arrest the person named in the warrant, but it doesn't give them permission to enter our property. If law enforcement comes to the door with an arrest warrant, the response from our staff is we cannot confirm or deny, but we can post a message. If we know that person and they're staying with us or have a way to contact them, we then reach out to them and tell them that there is an officer with a warrant for them and that they might possibly want to seek legal counsel, and give them the option, if they're there at the shelter at the time, to follow up with officers right then and there, but it is completely their choice. The client can then choose to go outside and respond to that warrant or not respond. If the client does want to respond, we do ask that they go outside or remain right there in the entry so that we don't violate confidentiality for other clients, and that we don't have the police in the building seeing other people. If the client does not want to follow up with the warrant in that moment and law enforcement doesn't leave, you just simply continue stating you cannot confirm or deny, but that you've posted a message. You can say that no one by that name has responded to the message, that type of thing. Very vague. Again, whether they're with us or not, even if they're not with us, we don't say that. We don't tell them that. Now, if the police have an arrest warrant and a search warrant that names Safe Place, our address, our premises, information about why they're searching Safe Place specifically, then we would let them in. And if that person is known to the program, we would tell them, and that's in an attempt to protect the confidentiality of others. So rather than having the police search the whole building for this person who we know is here, we're going to go ahead and ask that person to come meet with the police because they have a proper search and arrest warrant. We do still try to do that in a supportive manner, give the client a heads up before we let the police in that they're there and why we have to let them know that they're there, and support them through that process of that encounter with law enforcement. If the police have a valid search warrant and arrest warrant and the person is not staying in shelter, you can go ahead and tell them that the person is not staying in shelter. Again, that's to protect the confidentiality of all the other clients. So rather than having police search the building, we can just let them know that person's not staying here. So with arrest warrants, really, it's I can't confirm or deny unless the client wants to respond to the warrant right then and there, or they have a valid search warrant for the facility for Safe Place itself with the arrest warrant. That would be the only time that we do go ahead and tell them whether or not the person's staying here. If the police come and they have a search warrant for Safe Place, not regarding an arrest warrant specifically, the search warrant must specifically name the premises to be searched, address and description, the property or materials allowed to be seized, and has to be dated and signed by a judge or magistrate. There must also be an affidavit outlining the facts that support why the warrant was issued in the first place and is often referred to as the affidavit of probable cause. If police show with a search warrant, ask if you can first call the CEO or designee, deputy director, again, someone in leadership, depending on time of day, who's available, that type of thing. They might not allow for it, but do your best to document what's happening. Let them know that you're trying to get a hold of the CEO. I've never seen where the police will force their way in or that type of thing. Typically, what they're coming with is an arrest warrant or someone trying to serve a subpoena. We say we can't confirm or deny. They might get a little agitated with us, but we can fall on the laws. And I will say police, because our criminal justice advocate, Melissa, has done a phenomenal job of training, are better about knowing the limits to our confidentiality, and that just because they might show up with a warrant doesn't mean that we're going to tell them whether or not somebody is here. This is probably one of our most challenging policies to kind of wrap your brain around and to know in and out. And as you can tell by my description, it's one of those that's kind of hard to explain. But the default is really rely on accessing your policy manual in these situations. Typically, the police are not coming in, busting down doors. They're going to give you that chance to review your policy, call the on-call or supervisor to support you through this process. Because really no one should ever be having one of these encounters alone or trying to navigate it, because there are a lot of exceptions, a lot of if this happens, then do this. But the policy manual does have lengthy procedures on what to do in these cases where we're being served with legal documents. Again, it can be very intimidating, but just know these are laws that are protecting the work that we do. It's not us being resistant or doing something that we shouldn't. We would not be doing our jobs if we didn't protect the confidentiality of our clients. We will get where officers even just come to the door trying to do a wellness check on a survivor, and sometimes it might be their abuser who has requested that wellness check. And if we tell them, yeah, they're here and they're fine, or no, they're not staying here, that could put the person in even more danger, that now their abuser is going to find out whether or not they're staying with us. So as much as it can feel like wrong to not respond to law enforcement, there are many cases where we do not respond to them other than we can't confirm or deny. But in any case of legal documents being involved, we never ignore it, whether it's served properly or, handled correctly or incorrectly. Always call someone immediately to back you up on this and reference your policy for guidance on what to do in these situations. The reporting suspected abuse and neglect policy is in place to protect the safety and well-being of survivors and their children, as well as the general public from acts of violence. Safe Place is committed to protecting children and vulnerable adults. When an employee obtains information that suggests abuse or neglect has occurred, whether it's for a child or vulnerable adult, the employee and their supervisor must act quickly to make a report to centralize intake and respond to the concerns. So if you receive information that suggests child abuse or neglect or abuse of a vulnerable adult has occurred, the first thing that you'll want to do is report that to your supervisor or the on-call staff, whoever is available to you at that moment to consult on the situation. We never make these decisions alone. Even if it is a supervisor, they will contact another supervisor, because we know that the second we make these calls or reports to CPS or APS, that we are changing somebody's life, and that a lot of other things can come of that report, and some of it can involve safety concerns. So we always want to make sure that we're consulting with one another and making that decision as a team, so that we've talked through everything, we've identified that this falls under the child protection law and our duty as mandated reporters, that this is something we must report. So by working at Safe Place or volunteering or interning at Safe Place, you are a mandated reporter, since we work for a domestic violence agency. And we have to make sure that we walk that fine line, because we work with victims who their children may have been exposed to abuse, that type of thing. So we're really looking for that continued exposure or possibility of abuse or neglect occurring. So it makes it a little murky, since we work with people who have experienced a high degree of trauma. And that's why, another reason, it's good to talk with someone else about the information that you collect. So when a survivor discloses information that you believe might fall in this category of something we may need to report, the important thing is to stay calm. Just try to gather information. You're not an investigator, just, whatever that person shares with you. And we always try to let clients know ahead of time, and that's why it's in many of our documents that we are mandated reporters. And, they might give us information that we have to violate confidentiality for. So if someone starts sharing that kind of information, just stay calm, listen, gather the information. You don't have to ask a bunch more questions. Again, you're not the investigator. And depending on the situation, if the person is calm and this is about maybe somebody else, so maybe it's about their abuser who's not with them, you can let them know it might be something that they do have to report, but that you'll get back with them. And that, that is something we would do together with them, because if the person is cooperating, and especially if their report is not regarding the victim that we're working with, we do include the survivor in that conversation. They can make the call with us, that type of thing, to really do that together and walk through that with them. We do always have to make the report ourselves, so the survivor can make a report too, if it is on somebody like their abuser. But as mandated reporters, we have to make sure that a report also comes from us. Now, if the person, and this happens more, this is rare, because typically our reports are on things that survivors report to us either on their crisis call or when they come in that their abuser did. So maybe the other parent of their children did to the child. So those are typically a little easier to navigate because the survivor, it's still scary. CPS is always scary for people, but the report is not about that person or on that person. Now, if we observe behaviors that suggest abuse or neglect, and we're making a report on someone who is staying in shelter or a client we're serving non-residentially, that's another thing we consult with one another on to determine, is this something we can tell the client ahead of time? So for example, when we have seen situations of abuse happening in shelter and we are concerned that the person might flee before CPS is able to make contact, we might decide to hold off on informing the survivor until CPS is coming to investigate, so that, again, we want to come from a place of support and help the survivor through that. But if we know that children we are serving are possibly being abused or neglected, we have a duty to protect them as well. So we always do our best to include the survivor in these discussions, decisions, reports, that type of thing. But there are those extenuating circumstances where it might happen in a different order than what we would prefer. If you and your supervisor or whoever you're consulting with on this decision determine there is enough to report or enough that we are required to report, there are two ways. You can call it in through centralized intake or create an online profile to make a report online. We are okay with either one, but we do require that if you call centralized intake, that you keep a copy of the 3200, which is the form you have to fill out and send in after the call, or if you do that through the online portal, that you print it out and give to the deputy director so that we can track when we have made reports for the fiscal year. And then the deputy director will receive correspondence through mail on whether or not that case was assigned and investigated, that type of thing. So all of that is housed with the deputy director, and it's really only kept so that we can have that documentation of if we had to violate the person's confidentiality without their consent to make a report, and that we are doing our duty as mandated reporters to make those reports when we are required to. So even if a client says that, a CPS or APS report has already been made, we still have to make our own report. The only kind of exception to that is if we firsthand know and have seen CPS workers actively involved and that we're aware that they already know those concerns. So if a survivor enters shelter and says, I need to have a release signed, I have a CPS worker, explains the situation, and we see that CPS worker or that type of thing, then we don't need to make a separate report. We will follow up with CPS workers if we have new concerns, things like that. But again, those are all things you'll do in consultation with a supervisor, on-call staff. One thing that can be not easy to miss, but just a reminder, it's a lot easier to remember when you're face-to-face with somebody if they disclose possible abuse or neglect to report that and follow up. But we hear it on our hotline calls, and it can be a little tricky because you don't always have a lot of information on that person, but we still do have that same duty to report. So, even if you only have a name or a phone number or whatever that may be, we report what we have. And it might not be enough, maybe to us, the information we have is not enough for us to find that person, but we never know what information CPS and APS might have on an individual or be able to gather, to where if we can provide just a portion of it, they might be able to locate that person. So even if it's coming through a crisis call, we do need to still go ahead and make a report if it falls under the mandated reporting laws. And, making a CPS or APS report, like I said, that changes somebody's life. We take it very seriously. We do our best to include the survivor and, make it come from a supportive approach through that process with them. But it's also it can be taxing on the staff or the intern volunteer who might be involved in that. And so this is definitely one of those policies that when you do have to carry it out, it's important to practice self-care. It's important to talk with your colleagues and supervisors and make sure that you have support through this as well, so that both the clients and staff are supported when they have to make these reports. The critical incidents policy is in place to ensure appropriate documentation and follow-up after a critical incident occurs with the agency clients. This policy will also identify what is considered a critical incident for Safe Place. So employees and volunteers are required to document all critical incidents and report those incidents to their supervisor. Critical incidents can be a number of things, but some examples are any medical or psychiatric emergencies where you call 911 or get immediate support, any suicidal, homicidal threat or action by a person we're working with, if an employee or client is in danger or injured, if we have a child who's been abandoned in the building, if there is someone in immediate danger, if there is a death of a client, a high profile issue, like if there's media involvement, that type of thing. Anytime we involve 911, so ambulance, fire, emergency response, that type of thing. If there is a physical altercation between clients, any urgent problems with the security system, such as doors not properly shutting or locking, cameras not working, that type of thing, or any urgent maintenance issues that could cause damage to the property. These all need to be documented and responded to, obviously, immediately. Now, certainly there are situations where you're not able to call an on-call staff or your supervisor ahead of making decisions. So say somebody's having a medical emergency, you're going to just go ahead and call 911 before you reach out to anybody. But once kind of the situation is secured, whatever that may be, fire alarm goes off, you call the fire department, go ahead and call your supervisor if it's during business hours, or the on-call staff for after hours during those critical incidents, because that's the part of the reason for on-call is to provide that support in those situations. It can be tricky when there's one staff person or maybe only one or two with a volunteer, that type of thing, to navigate these challenging situations, especially if we've got a full shelter of 40 plus adults and children. So it's good to have that support and just kind of have that person who's removed from the situation to make sure we're following our policies and procedures and keeping clients and staff safe. So things for on-call include if you're considering that a client might need to be exited. So, we talked about like a physical altercation or a client threatening another client, something like that, where this might not be able to wait until the next day for this person to be asked to leave shelter. That's an example of when you could call on call. If you need advice or support on a client situation, how to handle a safety violation, if you are considering or needing some ideas or options for crisis calls or clients who are in danger, but maybe we don't have capacity at the shelter, or any of those other critical incidents that I discussed, those are all things that you could call an on-call staff for. And if it's during business hours, certainly just reach out to a supervisor or staff who are here on site for support. But in all of these cases, it's important to document afterwards, so we always have a good report of what happened and what we did to respond to these incidents. We ask that the report, it's a form, we ask that it is completed and turned into your supervisor at the end of your shift when the critical incident happens, so that things are documented in a quick manner and that it's fresh in your mind when you're documenting that situation. The Emergency Police Assistance Policy is in place to ensure the safety and confidentiality of clients, staff, and volunteers, and the security of the facility. Safe Place is committed to providing a safe and secure environment, and there may be times where emergency and police assistance is necessary to ensure the safety of all. Staff will call 911 for assistance if there is an immediate threat to safety or the security of the facility and make every effort to ensure client confidentiality is maintained, and when we're able to provide notice to clients of emergency response. So in situations where you need to call 911 immediately, do so. If you are in a situation where it being known that you're calling 911 would further jeopardize safety. So if there's a survivor or someone in the building making an immediate threat or experiencing a severe crisis in that moment, and you determine that calling 911 in front of them would jeopardize their or your safety even more. We have multiple panic buttons throughout the facility in all staff offices and in the resource center, underneath desks, that kind of thing that can be pressed, and law enforcement will respond to that without you having to call. So there is that option. Pressing the button does trigger a police response. And if you're unable to open the door for police responding, they will gain access themselves. So these are only to be used when it's not safe or you're not able to call 911. In those very rare extreme situations. If you're safe and you're able to call 911 via the phone or text message, that is always the better option. But that is available if need be. When you call 911 and you know that emergency response will be coming on site, it is appropriate to make an announcement, an all-call page, just to inform all the clients that of the situation. You don't specifically share what's happening unless it's fire or that kind of thing, but say you're calling for police assistance for something that's not an emergency, such as exiting a client who might, we're concerned might become a threat when they're being exited. You could make an announcement just indicating that law enforcement will be briefly present on site, and that if clients wish to remain in their rooms until they're not on site anymore, that's their option. That way, if clients don't want to potentially accidentally run into a law enforcement officer, that they are aware ahead of time that we might have them on property. That type of thing. We know that for a multitude of reasons, folks might not want to engage with the police, and that is their choice in most cases, unless we're calling on that specific person for assistance. So when we can let people know that emergency response is going to be on site, it's always good too, as long as the situation is secure, to let people know, that the facility is secure, that there's no immediate threat or anything, because, when we have a building full of people, it can be a little scary to have emergency response and not know what's going on. So without giving any, confidential information away or talking about clients to other clients, just letting them know, that the situation is secure and that emergency response will be on site for a period, and then letting them know when that is over. So, that the building is all clear and that, you can return to normal activity, that type of thing. In very rare situations where we receive reports or are concerned about clients having illegal drugs or weapons or that type of thing on site, we do safety sweeps using K9 certified in detecting illegal substances, explosives, and firearms. These are something that our criminal justice advocate coordinates, and again, it's something we do in very rare cases where we're fairly confident that there are things on our property that pose a risk of, a safety risk to other clients and their children. We have MOUs and partnerships with law enforcement where the way that we do these is we have clients meet in a living room. Once we have everybody in the living room, we explain what's happening. We do not have them interact with law enforcement at all unless they choose to. So we even have them in a space where law enforcement wouldn't even see them. to maintain their confidentiality. Law enforcement goes around with a staff member and the canine sweeps the rooms. If any items are found that pose a safety risk, such as illicit drugs or explosives, firearms, that kind of thing, things that we upfront disclose that we do not allow in our facility, the officer does not do anything with that information. They don't even know whose it is. They just indicate to us where they found, where the dog responded to, so that we can follow up with that client. Some cases, it might just be a conversation of, this was found in your room, or the dog alerted in your room. If you have these items on our property, please remove them immediately, and don't bring them back. Depending on if something is found, that type of thing, it might lead to someone being asked to leave shelter. For that time being, we will assist them with finding an alternate place to go with transportation. And no one is ever banned from S.A.F.E place. It just might mean that that given moment, they're not in a position to help maintain the safety of the facility. Those sweeps are meant to make sure that the facility is safe and that there are not items in the facility that could pose a risk, to the best of our ability, and they are not meant to bring about criminal charges or anything like that to survivors. We tell survivors that, and that is the agreement we have with law enforcement. Again, they never even know, if they do find anything, they never even know whose it is, to help us with these challenging situations. And it always comes from a place of support, as we try to in all cases at S.A.F.E place. So if drugs are found, certainly we understand, especially with folks who have been exposed to such high levels of trauma, that might be something that they're engaging in, and that's none of our business unless they want our support in accessing resources. But we do ask that they do not bring those drugs or whatever it may be on site, and that they use off site. And we have no issue with people being under the influence as long as they're able to maintain the health and safety of themselves and others in those scenarios. We work very closely with law enforcement, and while we do sometimes encounter instances where it can be a little challenging, or there might be some disagreements on how to handle a situation, these are always times where you would call an on-call staff or supervisor for support, but we try to always make sure we're maintaining confidentiality and that we are coming at it from a place of, anytime we involve the police, that can be scary, traumatic, triggering for the survivors we serve. So we want to do our best to minimize those effects and to prepare people for such a response. The providing services and shelter to abusers policy is in place to ensure that we are meeting the needs of victims and not serving or providing services to abusers. So we do our best to take all precautions possible to screen for eligibility of services to avoid providing services or shelter to abusers. And this includes searching all prospective client names in our agency database, EmpowerDB. Our database maintains information on abusers that survivors have provided us with, and when we search by name, it'll indicate if that person has been associated with being an abuser of someone we have served, and that person would not qualify for services in that instance. If it is determined that this person calling for services is an abusive partner, we give very general language. We don't confirm that we know they're an abuser or that we're working with their victim, as that would violate confidentiality. Rather, we would, say something to the effect of, services with S.A.F.E place are not available at this time, and refer them out. So if it's for shelter, referring to a homeless shelter, that type of thing. But we want to make sure that we do not indicate that we are working with someone who has been victimized by this person, as that would violate confidentiality. We recognize that there might be exceptions, for instance, when a victim is charged as the abuser, when they have fought back or that type of thing. Maybe somebody who was listed as somebody's abuser is now being victimized, years later, or that type of thing by someone else. So these are cases where you would contact on-call your supervisor to process through. Sometimes we might have another staff person have a conversation with that individual, because it can be quite tricky in those cases to determine who is the victim, who is the abuser, because everything is self-report. So we take survivors at their word and believe them, but oftentimes if it's someone posing as a victim, if it is the abuser trying to gain access to our shelter because they know their victim is staying here, that's why we have those measures of our database maintaining those names. And typically that information will come out upon further assessment by asking further questions or having them talk with another staff member, and that type of thing. If, say, an abuser gets into shelter and that is discovered, that is somebody's abuser or that they're a threat, we then follow the emergency and police assistance policy to make sure that when we ask that person to leave, that all the clients and staff are safe, and services will be terminated immediately. If a known abusive partner enters Safe Place property, the abusive partner will be asked to leave immediately and with police assistance if necessary. If the victim is someone we're working with or that person, we will notify them so that they know their partner may have found them. So this comes up where, we do sometimes have where abusers will come to the door. They might know we're Safe Place, or they might know that the person their victim is staying here and that type of thing. So we want to make sure that we are responding to it. We're making sure that person gets off our property immediately, and that we are letting that victim know, because maybe they don't know that their abuser knows where they are, that type of thing. So overall, we do not provide services to abusers, including counseling or batterers intervention. There are other agencies and places that provide those services. In those instances where it's a little tricky to determine who the abuser might be or what the situation is, that's when you reach out for assistance. And if it is a situation of self-defense, dual arrest, that type of thing, we certainly do take that into consideration and make sure that we are serving the victim, even if law enforcement or the prosecutor has determined that they did something that qualifies legally as domestic violence or that type of thing. Those instances are infrequent. So for the most part, if you search and find the person listed as an abuser, it can be pretty straightforward. But again, always reach out for support in those rare instances. The on-call policy is in place to provide backup support via phone, on agency policies and procedures in the event of a special situation or emergency, and on-site physical response in extreme or dire circumstances. So at all times, 365 days a year, 24/7, we have a senior staff or supervisor available to provide backup support and procedural guidance to shelter advocates, interns, volunteers who are on site during after hours, weekends, that type of thing. Most situations that occur day to day, they can be handled by the staff on duty, but sometimes there are those situations where it's good to have that support, and just someone to even talk through things or process through afterwards. So that's why we wanted to make sure that we always have someone available to staff, volunteers, and interns working those off shifts, to have support from. So there's an on-call schedule that's maintained and housed at the desk, and it alternates between typically 4 or 5 staff members on a weekly basis. And the phone numbers for those individuals are listed on the calendar. Throughout this training, we have mentioned and will continue to mention circumstances where you would call an on-call staff member, and that is exactly what that's for. So this training is covering instances and where we would follow these policies and procedures that don't happen every day, but that can be tricky to navigate when we do have to follow them. And then that is why there is that option or requirement to reach out to on-call staff as we navigate these situations. To ensure the confidentiality is maintained for clients, any inquiry regarding a client or an individual who is believed to be a client is responded to in a very specific way. So we follow this client inquiry policy to ensure consistency among staff and volunteers and fairness to clients. So when someone is reaching out to inquire about a client we serve or someone we might be potentially serving or they think we are serving, we do not confirm or deny anyone's presence or absence regardless of whether the named person is a Safe Place client. The only exception is when the client has signed a valid release of information and that release is up to date and the date has not expired. The other exceptions, when we would release information, we discussed in other policies, but as we've covered, information that suggests child abuse or neglect or abuse of a vulnerable adult, if we make those calls, then we would respond to those inquiries. You can provide general information on agency-related policies, that type of thing. So a very common thing that we get is someone advocating for a client who maybe was denied shelter or was asked to leave shelter for those more extreme situations. And while we can't confirm or deny, we can explain general policies. So if a survivor, if somebody's calling saying we denied someone shelter, we can say, that we do follow a protocol and eligibility screening and that we do need to talk to that survivor, and that we take many factors into consideration, but any survivor, even if denied shelter, is still eligible for other non-residential services, that type of thing. Or if somebody, calls saying this person says they were exited because of X, Y, and Z, you can say, typical reasons someone might be exited or asked to leave, that we don't ban clients, that type of thing that folks can always call back to be screened for eligibility. And sometimes that can help because especially other agencies might get a little frustrated that we're not able to provide more information on survivors that we're working with. But if you can give some general information on agency policies and procedures, that might help put the pieces together for them without giving them anything specific on that client. If in the rare instances where the person trying to inquire about a client gets upset, you can always refer them to your supervisor, transfer them to leave a message, because at the end of the day, you can't confirm or deny unless you have that release signed and it's a valid current release. And so you don't need to stay on the phone or have them at the door for an extended period of time because your answer will not change. If somebody, you could always respond with, I cannot confirm or deny, but I can post a message. And then if that client is staying with Safe Place or someone you're working with, you can let them know that they, this person is reaching out to them, inquiring about them, wanting them to follow up. And then it's up to that person to follow up with them. If, say, you have somebody on the phone or at the door and they're not leaving or, don't want to get off the phone until you give them an answer, you can let them know the message has been posted. And if that individual is able to receive the message and wants to respond, that they will do so and get off the phone, ask the person to leave our private property, that type of thing. But your default answer is always, I cannot confirm or deny, but I can post a message. The client rights and responsibility policy is in place to outline the rights and responsibility each client has to ensure the health and safety and comfort in a communal living environment. Communal living and staying in a shelter is very challenging for everyone, so we have tried to identify what areas pose the biggest risk and the most amount of issues for survivors when they're staying in shelter, and have things in place to try to maintain a peaceful, clean, sanitary, safe environment. So at Safe Place, we use the phrasing and come from the standpoint of survivors have the right to a safe, clean, confidential, and healthy environment to receive our services. And part of having that right is also their responsibility to help maintain that type of environment. So upon intake, clients are provided with rights and responsibilities for their participation in shelter, and Safe Place staff go over that and make sure that clients have a chance to ask questions, to ask for clarification, ask for any accommodations that might need to be made, give feedback, that type of thing. And if the client determines at that point that this is not the right space for them to be in for whatever reason, then we will help with relocation if that's what they wish to pursue. Any individual who violates the basic rights of others in shelter and jeopardize the safety, comfort, confidentiality, and or health of others may be asked to leave per the exiting a residential client policy. Again, no one is ever banned from Safe Place, and it doesn't mean they can't come back for shelter services in the future. And the other piece of that is just because someone may be being asked to leave shelter, they still have full access to all of our non-residential services. And when we ask someone to leave shelter, we will offer options such as assisting them with identifying other shelter options, with calling the shelters if there's a barrier or a need for that type of assistance, and with transportation as well. So we want to make sure that the client's right to safety, including protection from being re-traumatized or triggered, we want to make sure that we're taking care of the type of environment that we have here at Safe Place. So things like yelling, being aggressive, physically, verbally, that type of thing, those can all be major triggers for other people, even if they're not directed at other clients. You know, what we get a lot of is someone may be on the phone and they're yelling and they're swearing or threatening someone or that type of thing, and that can be really triggering for the other clients around them. Things like violating confidentiality. So, you know, a lot of our clients might know each other or know of each other, and it is still required that they maintain that confidentiality as a condition to stay here at the shelter, and that they won't give out confidential information about one another. The health and safety piece, we do ask clients to complete one daily commitment to help keep the shelter safe and clean. We don't have any sort of like cleaning company or anything that comes in, so it really does take all the clients and staff to make sure that the building stays as clean as possible. So a commitment might look like wiping down the counters and refrigerators in the kitchen, cleaning the floors in the bathroom, cleaning the sinks and the toilets in the bathroom. It's typically not even an entire area that we're asking someone to clean. And any accommodations that people may need, whether it's for, you know, physical limitations, or some survivors come in and they're injured, we refer them to either our shelter manager or our lead shelter advocate to talk through those. And sometimes it might be that the person be assigned to the same commitment every day that's doesn't require as much, such as like wiping down counters. It might be that the person does not do any commitments when they're here at Safe Place. So it's really determined on a case-by-case basis, but the shelter manager and lead advocate are the two that have those discussions with survivors. Any physical altercation or anyone who poses an immediate threat of danger will be asked to leave, and that's whether that's towards other clients or staff. No one should feel unsafe because of somebody else staying here. We ask that clients are here by 11 o'clock each night to maintain the security of the facility. So at night, we only have one staff person working, and we do set an alarm. It's a large facility for one staff person to monitor. And if people are going in and out constantly, the alarm has to be shut off and turned back on, or it'll go off and wake everybody up. So we do ask that folks try to be here by 11. It also helps with tracking to make sure people are staying here and using the beds that we are providing. So certainly we make exceptions if somebody, works second or third, and, that's the time that they leave, or they have something happening where, it's a legitimate reason that they might not be able to be back by that time. We'll definitely work with them. And we ask that they talk with either the survivor advocate or survivor advocacy coordinator, whoever they're assigned to discuss those concerns. And with the bed usage, we are frequently very full, and so we do ask that if they're staying here, that they don't take more than 2 nights out every 30 days of their stay. And again, that is just to make sure that the beds are being used by those that need them. And again, we will make exceptions for extenuating circumstances, and they just need to talk that through with their advocate. With all rights and responsibilities, these are things that we're constantly reevaluating, talking through as a team, seeing if there's different ways that we can do things to better accommodate survivors, come from an empowerment-based approach while still maintaining the health and safety of a very large facility. So these topics are always up for discussion as a team, and we are always open to trying different ideas. So please don't hesitate to share those with your supervisor, colleagues, because we want to always be evolving and doing better for the survivors we serve. The school attendance policy is in place to ensure compliance with state laws regarding school attendance while protecting the safety of children who are staying in shelter. So when children come to shelter with their caregiver, they must begin the enrollment process within 3 days of coming to shelter. And the key word is begin the enrollment process. So we don't expect that folks would have their children enrolled and in school within 3 days. We just need to see that they're making that progress towards getting their children enrolled in school if they're not already enrolled in one of the local school districts. And once enrolled, or if they already are enrolled, when they come to stay in shelter, they must be attending regularly. Obviously, there's exceptions for illness and things like that. But when advocates start to notice that children aren't going to school most days, then there may be some concerns and follow up with that client in regards to their child. If children are not regularly attending school and the parent doesn't respond to assistance and support from advocates, the family may be asked to leave and offered alternate resources. Parents will be assisted by an advocate, one of the survivor advocates, with enrollment, access to transportation, and advocacy regarding the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act. We cover McKinney-Vento in another training, but basically our advocates work with the survivor to make sure that there's transportation, that students are being treated fairly, and that law is being followed properly. So advocates are happy to help, and we've, as with other things, we come at it from to identify what are the barriers. So if someone is not getting their child enrolled in school, rather than coming from a place of judgment, let's look at what barriers might be preventing that client from being able to access school enrollment. Barriers can range from simply not knowing how to fill out the application, to safety concerns of the abuser knowing where they go to school, to the school not complying with following McKinney-Vento and providing transportation. So there can be a number of things that make it challenging, and when someone's coming from a traumatic situation and you're faced with many barriers, it can take a little longer, or things might not line up the way that they hope. So our advocates work with survivors to get their children enrolled in school and make sure that we reduce as many barriers possible to keep those kiddos going to school. The vehicle, car seat, and transportation safety policy is in place to create a safe environment for transportation for staff, volunteers, and clients, and to ensure compliance with Michigan child passenger safety laws. So staff and volunteers must follow all state driving laws and vehicle safety procedures, such as wearing a seatbelt, having proper car seats and boosters for children, when driving or riding an agency vehicle and personal vehicles during work time. Staff driving the agency van will only use hands-free cell phone communication if necessary. And our finance manager makes sure that registration and insurance are up to date for the agency van. Staff and volunteers who have completed the proper checks to be able to drive the agency van and transport clients are responsible for making sure all passengers and themselves are wearing seatbelts in the proper seats, and that they're driving hands-free devices, driving in a manner that's safe and following all laws. Safe Place staff or volunteers who have completed the proper training can offer assistance and guidance on child passenger safety. So for car seats and boosters, there's trainings that folks can go to learn about kind of the different types of car seats and boosters and the weight limits and that kind of thing, and how to properly install those. So there are a number of staff who have been trained in that. And certainly we don't offer assistance if we don't know. If staff witness a client not following the Michigan child passenger safety laws, staff will first try to intervene and offer support. So again, look at barriers. Maybe they had to leave the car seat at home, and car seats are not cheap. So what can we do to support that client in maybe obtaining a car seat, whether it's for borrowing one from Safe Place, maybe we can help purchase one, maybe there are local community resources that have those available. So coming from that place of support, before we make those judgments of, is this an ongoing concern that might need to be reported? If it becomes a regular concern, and staff witness children not being properly secured when being transported, we see this sometimes when survivors get picked up and with their kids, and they might get in and out of vehicles and not have any car seats or boosters. And based on the child's age and size, staff know that they should have those. If it becomes an ongoing issue and resources and assistance are denied or not utilized, then that would be something that we would consult as a group and determine if that needed to be reported after many conversations with the client to make sure that there are no barriers in place. But it is our responsibility, especially when we're transporting, to make sure that all laws are being followed and not transport if things like car seats and that type of thing are not being properly utilized. The client access to case files policy is in place to ensure clients have appropriate access to their files while maintaining their confidentiality. So clients always have the right to view and access their files or their children's files upon requests. And we will follow procedures to ensure clients' access to files is safe and in a confidential manner. We don't include any client names or identifying information in other clients' files. So that should never be an issue, that one client's file have any identifying information of another client. But in the rare case that may accidentally happen, we would definitely redact that information that might violate someone else's confidentiality. Information from sources other than Safe Place may also be withheld from the client's review. Again, that would be a rare circumstance because we do not typically hold information from other agencies or sources. Our job is to work with the client and support the client, so we don't often receive things that we keep from other sources, and they are not to be kept in a client's file. If a client requests access to their case file or copies of their case file, that request must go to the deputy director. And that being me, I would follow up with the client just really to talk through what the purposes are and that type of thing. We can definitely have that sit down and look at the case file. And where it becomes a larger conversation is if the client is wanting copies of their case file, and that is really because of the want to protect that client's confidentiality. And once a file and records get released or get in anyone else's hands, it's out of our control who accesses them and what is done with them. So that's a conversation that I would have with that client to make sure that they fully understand the risks of that. And certainly if at that point they wanted a copy of their file, that would be something we would give them. But accessing their files is something that has to go through me as the deputy director or a designee if I'm not available. That's not just something at any given time clients can ask for, because there are many pieces to it, and we have to make sure that it's done in a consistent and confidential manner. I did cover the policy on requests from clients to copy their files in the previous client's access to file slide, but just to review, the goal is to make sure that clients are fully informed about the implications of requesting the copies of their file to be released, and those requests must come to the deputy director in writing so that we can be sure that clients are aware of the possible implications and meet with the deputy director to proceed with obtaining those copies of their files if that is something that they're interested, if they still want to pursue at that time. The client medical needs policy is in place to identify and develop consistent procedures to respond to client medical needs at S.A.F.E. S.A.F.E. employees receive annual health and safety trainings on topics including CPR, Narcan, and bloodborne pathogens. Should a client need medical attention, they will be offered transportation to the doctor, hospital, or 911 will be called depending on the urgency and request of the client. So if it's not urgent and the client is able to wait, we use a car service that we will pay for them to go to the hospital, and we will pay for them to get back from the hospital. If it's an urgent situation or the client is unable to speak for themselves or their children, 911 will be called immediately and the critical incidents protocols will be followed. Staff and volunteers are to never offer medical opinion or advice to clients. Clients will ask, and it's important to always inform them that we are not medical professionals and we are not qualified to give such opinions, and offer resources for local doctor's offices or the hospital or whatever may be appropriate depending on the need of the client. Those who are trained in CPR and Narcan are able to administer and follow those procedures, but again, that is something that staff are trained in and have annual certifications, and those are the only those who are certified and properly trained can offer that as an intervention. When we do call 911, we only give the information necessary because we don't want to cross into violating confidentiality for any other information related to that client. The drugs and alcohol policy is in place to establish expectations regarding drugs and alcohol and presence on S.A.F.E. property. So we're committed to ensuring a drug and alcohol-free environment for the safety of staff, volunteers, and clients. We completely recognize and understand that drugs and alcohol are a part of many people's lives, and that they can be coping, they can be something that abusers or traffickers used as a way to get their victim addicted to a substance or alcohol to further their dependence on them and that type of thing. So for us, really, there is no judgment around the use of drugs and alcohol. It really is that we need to maintain a safe environment, especially because we have a lot of kiddos that stay here. So drugs and alcohol are not allowed on our property, and if we find drugs or alcohol, a client may be exited. They can always still receive non-residential services, and as we cover in other policies, no one is ever banned from Safe Place. Typically, even if we find drugs or alcohol on property, that's something we have a discussion with that person, talk about the importance of keeping those items off property. And as long as there is an understanding and agreement and that it hasn't been a threat for safety to somebody else, we'll do our best to make sure that person can continue staying in shelter under the understanding that they can't bring anything like that in again. Clients who have been under the influence and left behind drugs or alcohol in communal areas of the shelter, those types of things where it could pose a threat to other people staying here, specifically children, those would be the more extreme situations where that person might be exited. But again, they are not barred from services. They can receive non-residential services. And anytime we're having these conversations with folks around substance use, not only is it that it's none of our business what people choose to do, but also from a place of support that if we're concerned about that person, there are resources, there are options if they're interested. And then we would assist that person with accessing services for substance use recovery if that was something that person was interested in. If a client is under the influence of drugs and or alcohol, they are allowed to be here as long as they're not a threat to the health and safety of others or themselves. So if the person is under the influence and they're keeping it peaceful, it's not impacting anybody else, again, none of our business, and we will support that person in making sure they're safe. If it becomes an issue where that person under the influence becomes a threat to themselves or others, again, staff work from a supportive stance of, we're concerned about you. How can, what harm reduction techniques can we assist you with to make sure that you're as safe as possible when you are using those types of things. If a client comes to a scheduled meeting, counseling session, anything like that, and they're under the influence, we do ask that they reschedule. And as I mentioned before, even if it's medical marijuana and they have a card for it, we do ask that they keep it off site. So because we are federally funded, even though marijuana is legal in Michigan, we still do not permit it on our property at Safe Place. Similar to alcohol, alcohol is legal, but it's not permitted on our property to maintain a safe environment. And for additional information on employee use and possession of drugs and or alcohol, please refer to the employee handbook. The grievance policy is in place to ensure that clients have the opportunity for recourse when they feel at any time they have been treated disrespectfully or unfairly by another client, staff person, or a volunteer. Upon intake in all of our programs, clients are made aware of the grievance procedure. Specifically in shelter, they sign a copy indicating they understand and know what that process looks like. We want to make sure that individuals understand they have rights while accessing our service, and that if they have any concerns, that there is a process to follow. The grievance procedure includes the option for the grievance to be reviewed by supervisors, depending on the situation. It can go to the deputy director, the CEO, and the board of directors is the final level of the grievance procedure. Clients can also have a designated support person to be with them at any time during the process, and anyone involved in filing a grievance will not be excluded from any Safe Place services because of filing that grievance. So we really want to make sure survivors' opinions and voices are honored, even if those opinions are negative of Safe Place, and that's how we learn and grow, and make sure that we're doing things appropriately for the people that we serve. So if someone wants to file a grievance, we first ask that if they're able to put it in writing, that helps us the best, and they can give that to any staff member, or if it is something that they don't want anybody seeing, they can seal it in an envelope, put it in the box at the entryway, or ask for it to go in someone's mailbox sealed in the envelope. So there are a lot of different options. If the individual, if writing it is not something that they can do, then they can provide that verbally to the appropriate person. And again, they can have someone with them during this process. So some individuals might want an advocate from another agency or that type of thing present to support them through this process. So for example, one time we had a survivor who had frequently stayed in shelter and she was denied shelter. And so she wanted to follow up with me about filing a grievance. And she had an advocate from 211 that was on the phone with her during that process for support. So, whatever that looks like for that person, that is completely fine. And as long as they've consented to that person being a part of the conversation, we are fine with that. And again, if putting it in writing is not an option for the individual, there are other options to verbally report that grievance. In writing just gives us the clearest understanding and can allow it to more quickly navigate all the channels. If the grievance is on another client accessing services, that will go to their advocate. If it is regarding a staff or volunteer, then it goes to that person's supervisor, and then again can kind of go up the food chain of going to supervisor, deputy director, CEO, and the board of directors. This is another reason that it's so important to document our conversations and things that we do for individuals, because we work with a lot of people and it can be challenging to remember what we've all done with each person that we're working with. And by having those records and those notes, that helps supervisors reviewing a grievance to get a clear picture of what the staff did during this process to provide services and kind of match up the timeline of events. The board of the directors is that final step in the grievance process, and normally we can resolve it much sooner than that. Very rarely does it go to the board of directors. And typically our most common grievance is around length of stay in shelter. Shelter is a tricky thing to navigate. There's a housing crisis, so people tend to want more time than what maybe we're able to give them in a temporary emergency shelter. But we see grievances for a variety of things, and it is the supervisor's stance to come from a place of curiosity and to really make sure that we get a clear picture of what happened and follow up with the appropriate parties. The communicable diseases policy is in place to identify and develop consistent procedures to deal with communicable diseases at S.A.F.E Place. So we are committed to the health and well-being of all employees, volunteers, and clients, and we work to follow specific procedures to reduce the spread of diseases. In extreme cases of highly contagious diseases, clients might be assisted with relocating to a more appropriate setting for the health and safety of all, such as a hotel. And we at S.A.F.E Place maintain cleaning products such as bleach to ensure availability of supplies for adequate cleaning and prevention. When the necessary sanitizing methods are beyond the capabilities of S.A.F.E Place staff or are too dangerous for staff exposure, we will use a professional cleaning company. We'll hire them to complete the sanitation or cleanup. So in the instance of those more extreme situations, as I mentioned in a previous slide, when we had a survivor who left behind remnants of drugs that were potentially dangerous to others who may breathe those in, that is an example of when we would call in a cleaning company. As far as communicable diseases, if someone we knew was highly contagious, we might have that room on quarantine for a while after the person left, or hire a cleaning company to come in and clean up. So there are those cases where we will hire outside folks to clean up in a situation like that. If a residential client is showing signs of a communicable disease, staff may participate in safety planning with the person to ascertain whether they might be able to have safe shelter in other settings, such as with a family member or friend at the hotel that we partner with. If there aren't any other safe options, that individual can be quarantined to their room, and we ask that they spend most of their time in their room, only leaving to use the restroom. Those types of things, leave shelter if they're leaving. We don't require them to, not leave their room. We just ask that they really try to keep it minimal and wear a mask if they're outside of their room. The shelter manager really oversees the kind of the planning and playing out of quarantining an individual. And that can be as specific as we have mini refrigerators, microwaves, things like that we will put in a quarantine room, so that, and then provide like microwavable meals and that type of thing, so that that person really only has to leave to use the restroom or to leave the facility. This has obviously become more of a common occurrence with COVID. And we've been able to navigate keeping individuals and families quarantined in certain areas and using certain restrooms. And then we do have a partnership with a local hotel who we can quarantine people at the hotel as well. So, knowing that we run a large communal shelter, we do our best to contain contagious illness and diseases and that type of thing as best as we can. If an employee shows signs of a communicable disease, they're encouraged to leave work if they're able and have coverage, and stay away from the facility until they've had no symptoms for at least 24 hours. If it's COVID related, we use the CDC calculator to determine eligibility to return to work, and really communicate with the supervisor. So you'll notice, again, especially with COVID, that we might have periods where the resource center is primarily locked, and we really do that in those instances where we have multiple clients with COVID or a highly contagious disease, or multiple staff. So staffing can be an issue. We are a smaller staff, and so if many of our staff get illness such as COVID at the same time, that can really impact our ability to keep services going 24/7. So we try to fluctuate as needed to keep everyone as safe and healthy as possible. That wraps up our presentation on policies and procedures. It is required, and we highly recommend reviewing the policy manual regularly, having it printed out or easily accessible. It is on the P drive to access when you need some backup. That's why we spend a lot of time developing and revising those procedures so that they're current and relevant to the work that you're doing. There are a lot of situations that come up at S.A.F.E Place that don't happen very often, but when they come up, it's nice to have that guide of what do I do in this situation. Of course, on-call staff is always a backup as well, but many of the procedures can be followed just strictly from this manual, and will indicate if it's necessary to notify on-call staff. So this presentation does not cover every one of our policies and procedures. We pulled out the ones that commonly come up and that we thought might be helpful to go into more explanation. Certainly, if you have any additional questions on any of the policies we covered or any other policies in the manual, please reach out to your supervisor to make sure that you have clarity on those. And again, just make sure you reference that policy manual regularly and keep yourself up to date on that. Thank you.